thank you so much for being here. I'll start with the warm-up questions. Could you briefly introduce your research on the reception of Greek tragedy and its political uses?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So, yes, my research has gone through several stages, but there is a common thread running through them. So I started off looking at adaptations of Greek tragedy from the late 20th and the early 21st centuries. And my argument there was that these postmodern rewritings were not the playful exercises critics often took them to be. They were doing real political work, drawing on feminism, post-colonialism and queer theory to give voice to perspectives that the classical tradition had shut out. So the fragmentation, the irony, the self-referentiality that we see in these texts, none of that was political deflection, but ways to challenge the exclusions of the canon. That became my book, Greek Fragments in Postmodern Frames, Rewriting Tragedy between 1970 and 2005. And that work kind of kept pushing me towards the bigger question. If these ancient texts can be mobilized for progressive political ends, they can equally be mobilized for reactionary ones. So from there I moved on into performance reception of Greek drama and how it was used in the context of fascism and National Socialism in the interwar period. And more recently, continuing that work on interwar fascism, I've been looking at how the classical heritage is being appropriated by the contemporary far right. So I guess the connecting thread here is a single question: how does the present shape the way we understand and engage with the classical past? And once you see that shaping, you also see how these ancient texts and ideas end up serving political and ideological ends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So maybe you kind of already talked a little bit about it, but so what first drew you to the relationship between classical theater and political ideology in general?
Yeah, I guess I addressed it theoretically, but this is a more kind of personal story, which I'm happy to share. So it was a long path with some decisive moments along the way. I studied theatre at the School of Philosophy in Athens, which is the equivalent of what you call an arts and humanities faculty in the Netherlands. So studying classical texts was a central part of the curriculum, and the assumption underlying all of it was that these texts are kind of venerated, timeless, they're universal, something standing outside history and ideology. But that, of course, is precisely how ideology works at its most effective, by claiming that kind of universality. So the pivotal moment for me was in 1998, I think it was 1998 or 7, but when I watched the production of Sophocles' Electra at the Ancient Theatre of Epidaurus. And it was a production that treated the classical text very freely. It deconstructed it, kind of parodied the characters, played with the form, and yet it retained a strong connection to it. And I remember thinking that to transform a text like this is already to make a statement about our relationship with the past. And this is a political question. So especially in the context of modern Greece, which is my home country, this continuity with classical antiquity tends to be treated as simply natural, so it goes completely unquestioned. But soon I realized that Greece was not doing anything fundamentally different from what the Western tradition has always done with the classics. Greco-Roman antiquity has provided the means to define European and by extension Western cultural identity, to legitimize claims of superiority over everyone else. And we see it in colonialism, we see that in fascism. So this is how I came to it.
It's quite interesting. It's also a nice segue into our next question. What do you think? How do you think in Greek tragedy the distinction between the self and the other is traditionally constructed?
Yeah, in a sense, the whole edifice of Greek tragedy is built around this distinction, both in terms of content, what the texts are about, and also in terms of spectatorship. The Athenian who sat in the theatre in the 5th century BCE as a spectator, he was in all likelihood an adult male citizen, somebody who belonged to the city by birth. So women, slaves, foreigners were at best peripheral to the event. We don't actually know whether women attended the performances, whether they were allowed into the theatre at all. But on stage, tragedy represents slaves, women, and barbarians, and often in ways that expose their vulnerabilities and the injustices done to them. So there is something significant in the gap between who is watching and who is being represented on the stage. And within classical scholarship, this question of self and other has generated heated debates. So one school argues that this is precisely the ideological mechanism through which Athenian identity was constructed. A landmark study here is by classicist Edith Hall, her book Inventing the Barbarian. And Edith Hall demonstrated that the figure of the barbarian in Greek tragedy was above all a construction, the defining other, against which Greek identity was articulated and consolidated. But other schools of thought see tragedy as a space where Athenians questioned themselves, examined their own contradictions, gave voice to those otherwise excluded from civic life. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive, though. Tragedy as a form, at the same time, turns inwards and outwards, interrogating the self while constructing the other. And we also need to remember what kind of occasion that was. Theatre in ancient Athens was not part of leisure in the modern sense. It was a religious occasion embedded in the communal life of the polis, which means that these representations of the other were part of how the city defined and kind of reproduced itself.
So the understanding of the self and the other was not independent of the power structures that were already there in the city. They were in some sense already following from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a product of these power structures, but also a way to interrogate them, right. I would say.
How do you think that earlier interpretations of this classical cultural tradition contributed to discussions or contributed to ideas of cultural superiority or exclusion?
Yeah, that depends on what we mean by early theatrical traditions in this context. But if we're talking about the revival of ancient drama in early modernity, like the Renaissance rediscovery of the classical texts and the emergence of new theatrical forms based on ancient drama, the picture is nuanced. So here we have humanism, traditions of humanism that emerged, and they placed Greco-Roman antiquity at the center of what it means to be cultivated, what it means to be educated. And theatre was part of that project. But this was primarily about recovery of the ancient texts and kind of emulation. The harder ideological edge comes later, and this is something I've been primarily preoccupied with in my own work. It's a later moment in modernity, which is where I see the most explicit entanglement between theatrical revival and ideology. So this is exactly what I research. And this is when outdoor productions of ancient drama begin to emerge in a more systematic way. So the attempt to revive ancient drama in what was supposed to be its original setting, the open air. So what happens at this moment is that Greco-Roman antiquity gets reinvented as an idealized past, a time of wholeness, purity, vitality, that modernity was seen to have lost. So the modern society had lost something in ancient drama, and ancient culture at large could help it recover it. So ancient drama festivals, we have dance movements inspired by Greece, we have body culture movements sweeping Europe, and eventually fascist regimes. So all drew on this kind of reimagined antiquity as a vehicle for cultural and national renewal. And theatrical traditions contributed to ideas of superiority, but the mechanism is not as, one of straightforward transmission. It operates through the modern appropriations of the classical, through what we might term as a politics of revival, a politics of reception.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that kind of goes well into the next section we have. Your work examines how classical theatre has been used in nationalist and fascist contexts. What makes theatre such a powerful political tool?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because I do agree that theatre is a very powerful political tool, because it operates on multiple levels at the same time: cognitive, experiential, sensory, emotional, social. It is a collective experience. It engages the body and the senses. It immerses the spectator in a different experience, in a narrative, or even the ritual experience of the moment. So it creates community in the act of watching. When you sit in a theater, especially an open-air theater, we can all imagine that, you're not just an individual spectator, you're part of a crowd that shares that emotional experience, and that shared experience can be shaped and channeled in different ways then. And what fascist regimes understood very well is this communal dimension that theatre has, and they mapped it onto their own political aspirations. So both Italian fascism and National Socialism were obsessed with creating what historian Emilio Gentile has called sacralization of politics, so turning political life into a form of ritual. And Greek theatre, with its roots in a religious festival, a chorus speaking for a community, its open-air setting, capable of holding thousands of spectators, all of these elements offer the perfect model for exactly this kind of political event. Which is a cultural event, but it is used for political purposes.
Yeah, very interesting. How can performance reinforce ideas of national identity or cultural purity?
Yeah, there are some recognizable patterns in that regard. The first is the claim to heritage. Yeah, by staging, for example, a Greek tragedy, a regime can position itself as a legitimate heir to the great civilization that Greece was. The second is what we could describe as dehistoricization, so stripping the text of its original civic and political context and presenting it as a timeless and universal kind of text, as if it were speaking directly to the present. And so the text can be bent in this way to carry meanings that have little to do with its original intellectual content or the narrative, but with the authority of classical tradition itself. And the third pattern that I find quite interesting is that of the body, the use of the body. What performance history can show us is that it is not only the text that carries ideological meaning, but the performing bodies themselves and what they do in the performance event. So the chorus can be used to embody ideals of collective discipline, for example. These resonated very well with fascism aspiration to forge a new national body. So the political work of theatre happens at every level: the text, the space, the bodies on stage, ultimately the spectator watching.
You kind of talked a little bit about the patterns, but are there recognizable patterns in how regimes use classical narratives to define us versus them?
Yeah, I would say yes. It has to do with this idea that by reviving an experience that the ancients used to have, we are them, we become them through this collective event. And that would be one way in which this happened. It doesn't happen again through the narrative. This is something that struck me since the beginning of this research, that it is not so much the ideological appropriation of a narrative or of a plot or of ideas. For example, I recall a production, 1936, the Nazis staged Aeschylus, the Oresteia, as part of the Olympic Games celebrations in Berlin, 1936. And there the play was presented as the founding myth for a new order, a story of transition from chaos and disorder into discipline and civilization. So the play's preoccupation with the emergence of democracy, the question of how a civilized community establishes justice, did not interest them. So the performance read something entirely different into the text. So what matters is, I would say, more the act of staging, the claim to this tradition that comes through the very act of staging, and the kind of collective imaginings that the performance enacts and gives form to, gives a body to.
That's quite interesting. Now on to the play that we're looking at as part of our research, Waiting for the Barbarians. This play draws this line between a civilized people and an imagined enemy. Do you see parallels between this and what was done in ancient Greek tragedies?
Yeah, in a way, I think that not exact parallels, but I think that Waiting for the Barbarians, the novel, is a very good work to think about alongside classical tragedy and its modern adaptations and appropriations, because the novel is essentially a commentary on the mechanism that is central to how power operates. So the barbarian is not a reality. It is an imaginary construction, a political fiction fabricated by the empire that needs an enemy to justify its own violence, to perpetuate its own logic. And so what exists there is the empire's need to exist. But for the Greeks, the enemy, of course, existed. The Persians were real. And yet, they were still ideologically constructed as the other and defined, the other defined against Greek identity. So what matters is how the ancient image of the other as barbaric has been mapped again into the long histories of colonialism that Coetzee is writing against. And the line runs from ancient Athens through centuries of imperial thinking, and the novel makes that line quite visible, even if somehow implicitly.
To what extent do you think that performances of Greek tragedy affect audiences' emotional understanding of civilization versus the barbarian?
Yeah, they can do that, and that goes both ways, I guess. It can definitely participate in the formation of a sense of identity, but I think you're asking me how they do that, and not what exactly they deliver, because they can deliver different forms of collective identity, or they can participate in shaping different kind of identifications. But how they do that, now coming to the means that theatrical performance uses to do that, I would say that they can do something that the written text alone cannot do. When we read a story, we engage intellectually, imaginatively with the construction of the barbarian. When we watch the story on stage, that body is present. So we see how the other is represented physically, we see how they move, we hear how they sound, what they look like. So there are visual and sonic dimensions that participate in producing the meaning that operates beyond the level of the text or the dialogue or what the characters say and do. And I would go a step further than that and say that performance can also operate beyond the semantic altogether. There is music, there is rhythm, there will be lighting, spatial arrangement, and the relationship between the bodies in the auditorium. And all these work in kind of they work on us, they produce responses. And this is precisely what makes performance such a powerful instrument for shaping responses to ideas like civilization and barbarism, because they give it a physical presence and they also kind of elicit an emotional effect towards it. So you don't need to argue the other is threatening in a performance. You can invoke stereotypes and activate them physically, making the audience experience something in the body.
Right. So when you read a text, they're more so appealing to on an intellectual level. But when you see the play happen in a physical space, then it taps into this group energy that politically can be used to charge stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And even if it goes against the ideas expressed in the text, that can still operate to create a sense of collective identity.
Right, because when you're in this environment, you can't just, stop and think, okay, well, technically, this isn't what the author meant. You're just charged with the energy. Is that the...
Yeah, it's a very fair point, because that comes with any kind of narrative that unfolds real time, especially in theater when you don't have the option of stopping, taking time to think. But I don't want to argue here that theater works against thinking altogether. I'm saying that it is a powerful mechanism to actually deliver political effect. And this can reinforce sinister ideologies. It is also a powerful tool for creating a sense of civic collective identity, so it can also reinforce a more democratic sense of belonging and togetherness.
Okay. Do you think that in theater you often see this narrative of the other and if an external threat persists across different works? And if so, why?
Well, in theater we see it Yes, but I think that this narrative about the other is everywhere around us, especially at the current political time. And it exists because it offers, the narrative exists, because it offers something comforting but in a twisted way. It reduces the complexity. So there are social tensions, economic failures, material challenges, political contradictions, and all of these are difficult, uncomfortable to confront. So it's easier to locate the source of the problems in a figure who is defined as different, threatening, alien. And but this is where I think that actually the relationship with tragic narratives becomes interesting, because tragedy as a form, as a genre, actually pushes in the opposite direction. So in tragedy, we don't have heroes and villains. We don't have perpetrators and victims. We have ethical dilemmas. We have moral complexity, choices that are impossible. We have heroes who act rightly, but at the same time, they inevitably cancel another moral choice. So acting rightly in one moral domain violates a different moral order. Think of Antigone, the duty to her brother, the duty to the state. There are no clear resolutions. There is no easy identification. It's not easy to define what's good, what's evil. So I would say the tragedy lies precisely in that tension. So it works against the narratives, the simplifying narratives of self, another, if you pay close attention to how the texts operate.
Right, because the protagonist in a tragedy is the person. Like the main point of a tragedy is that the protagonist has a limit, and it's trying to show you that limit, and it's trying to show you what flaws there are in what you consider to be what you're supposed to identify with. So if in Antigone you're supposed to identify with Antigone, then the point of the play is to show you, okay, in that situation, what are her flaws? And as you said, that this format of the tragedy works against this absolute narrative of us being the good people and the other being the bad people.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that tragedy is a form that can cultivate empathy, but beyond that, an understanding of difficult moral choices and how much it's not about heroic kind of acts in a way. It is about the failings and the limitations.
Very interesting. And I think you kind of touched a bit about this, but your research also touches on the far right and contemporary political uses of classics. How do these historical patterns reappear today?
Yeah, it is a common assumption that the far right today borrows symbols from the classical past or kind of ideas for rhetorical prestige, because they carry some kind of cultural significance. But I have a slightly different take on these. Actually, it doesn't use them only for the prestige. It metabolizes them, transforms them. It uses kind of myth and ancient history as a living political grammar to produce modern mythologies. And this appropriation runs across the entire spectrum of the contemporary far right. We see the classical past providing the civilizational argument. Greece as a cradle of democracy becomes the counterpoint to an Orient defined as despotic and threatening. So the barbarian at the gate returns in the far right imaginary as the Muslim immigrant, the refugee, the outsider, against whom European identity must be defended. But sometimes also the classical past within far-right cultures feeds a more forward-looking politics. Even I understand that this may come across as a contradiction, but far-right pseudo-philosophers and intellectuals reach for figures from classical antiquity, like Prometheus, to create kind of new heroic examples of a kind of transformed humanity, humanity that defies the limits, a blueprint for radical political projects. We have, for example, a lot of appropriation of the figure of Prometheus to develop ideas about biotechnological enhancement and transhumanism within contemporary far-right cultures.
That's quite interesting. I didn't know about this.
Same. Now on to our last few closing questions. What should audiences be aware of when engaging with politically charged performances like in this opera?
What is the audience's view?
Like, in general, I think, like, if they, like, watch this...
If you had to suggest how an audience should receive such a work, what attitude do you think they should have towards theatre?
Yeah, so we, as an audience, how we can position ourselves in a way to... How to analyze that, you mean? How we...
Or how to experience it.
How to experience it, yeah. Well, if you want to experience it through the political kind of lens that we have been discussing, but even coming to other kind of dimensions of reception, I would advise you to start with your own experience as a spectator and pay attention to what the story does, how it addresses you, what does it make you side with, and how does it achieve that? How does it position you in terms of identification? But also how much agency you are allowed as a spectator to interpret yourself, and how much is answered already by those who have created the work. What emotional mechanisms are in place? What kind of emotional mechanisms are deployed to produce solidarity in one instance and distance from another character, let's say? And who are you in the story at the end of the day? And if we can track this kind of responses, I think we begin to reinsert a critical perspective into what we can feel as a purely kind of artistic experience. And that is where I think the political analysis of performance really begins, not from the outside, but inside our own responses to the narratives, but also the sensations that the performance generates. And I would say that theater is one of the most revealing lenses we have for understanding political life, because theater and politics share two powerful mechanisms, narrative and affect, emotion.
Very interesting. And lastly, are there any concepts, texts, or performances you think is essential for us to look at in relation to this topic?
Yeah, if you haven't already encountered Aeschylus directly, I think now is the time. That would be my starting point, which is the play is so fundamental about how we conceptualize the divide between self and other. I would also recommend the book Barbarism and Its Discontents by modern Greek scholar Maria Bolletsi, who will be giving a keynote at our upcoming ISTAB conference, Waiting for the Barbarians. And the examination is about what it actually means to be waiting for the other, the politics of that waiting, the anxieties and the projections kind of embedded in that act of waiting. So it's a good conceptual and historical framework for thinking about the opera you're about to experience. For inspiration, I would also point you to Walter Benjamin's concept of the new barbarian that was discussed in his essay Experience and Poverty. And for Benjamin, the barbarian is not the threatening other, but somebody who has lost everything and has to start from scratch. So it is like a figure who can reimagine and create something radically new. So it's a counterpoint to what we have been discussing so far. It is a promise for something new and not the defining other, not the threatening other, not somebody who is opposite us.
And that concludes our interview. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.